this week's episode of Life After Fame. Today, we dive into a profound event that unfolded in 1970 during a period marked by significant social and political turbulence in the U.S. Against the backdrop of a nation grappling with the effects of war, the echoes of civil unrest from the 1960s and a rapidly evolving cultural landscape, a remarkable story emerged. It was a story of resilience and determination embodied by a group of defiant black players at Syracuse University. The year 1970 was not a time for serious young black men in America to silently endure injustice any longer. It was a time to take action and make a stand. Pride, self-respect, and self-reliance had become the measures of dignity throughout the 60s. And the Syracuse 8, the focus of this week's episode, refused to back down from these principles. The Syracuse 8 boycott in 1970 was a significant event in the history of college sports. The boycott involved a group of African American football players at Syracuse University who protested against racial discrimination within the football program. Amidst the uncertainties of the era, the Syracuse 8, as they came to be known, emerged as catalysts for change. They stood at the intersection of sport and societal progress, embodying the spirit of resilience that defined the times. Their actions symbolized the collective quest for equality and justice in an era when the world around them seemed to be shifting. These young men at the time arrived at Syracuse University with dreams of both playing professional football and obtaining a degree. However, their expectations quickly turned to disappointment. The football team, the coach, Ben Schwartzwalder, and the university itself fell short of the promises made to them. They discovered that the school of Jim Brown and Ernie Davis was not what they had imagined. The recruiters had an impression of fairness, but in reality, it was far from the truth. Not only were the Syracuse 8 subjected to scrutiny in their personal lives, but their personal freedoms were also at stake. Their complaints to the coaches fell on deaf ears, resulting in dismissal, ridicule, and punishment. Feeling trapped and left with no choice, they made the difficult decision to walk away from practice, resulting in their subsequent exile, ending all hopes of playing for the university and any professional football career that might follow afterward. Adding to the gravity of their circumstances, it came to light that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the time, had placed the Syracuse 8 on a terrorist list as a result of their boycott action. This shocking revelation intensified the pressure and scrutiny they faced, exacerbating an already challenging situation. Moreover, it unleashed a torrent of hate correspondence from across the nation, further burdening the 8 players with the weight of unwarranted animosity. Their grievances extended beyond the field. The Syracuse 8 faced bias in academic advisement, discriminatory quotas limiting black participation on the team, broken promises regarding the hiring of a black assistant coach, and inadequate medical care for sports-related injuries for the entire team. Join us as we delve into the forgotten story of the Syracuse 8 boycott of 1970, exploring the courageous actions of the enduring impact of these trailblazing athletes who stood up against racial discrimination in college sports. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the struggle for equality and the lengths individuals must go to bring about meaningful change. Even after 50 years since the Syracuse 8 boycott, it remains disheartening to witness the limited attention given to the profound issues these athletes risk their careers for. It begs the question, have times truly changed? The stories of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf and Colin Kaepernick come to mind, where their protests in 1995 and 2016, respectively, effectively ended their careers. As we reflect on these events, it prompts us to reevaluate the upcoming induction of Coach Ben Schwartzwalder, the most successful football coach in Syracuse school history, into the Syracuse Ring of Honor this fall. Today's episode of Life After Fame compels us to question his induction deeply. Did old Ben have a chance to make a significant impact in 1970? But ultimately, he chose to align himself with the status quo. This episode uncovers a pivotal moment in history, serving as a powerful reminder of the courage and lasting legacy of those who dare to challenge the established order. The actions of the Syracuse 8 forced us to confront uncomfortable truths and examine the power dynamics at play. Instead of embracing change, Coach Ben Schwartzwalder allocated his energy toward assigning blame, pitting black players against white players, and deflecting responsibility into the university's chancellor. Join us as we tell this crucial chapter in the history of sports and society. Through the lens of the Syracuse 8, we explore the potential for transformation and the profound impact of those who refuse to accept the status quo. Their stories shed light on the importance of courage, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for true equality.
Welcome to Life After Fame podcast. Just imagine 70,000 fans cheering your name when you've scored the winning touchdown. Imagine standing on stage looking out at the crowd, rocking out to that chart-busting song you created. The applause and recognition you received for your masterful acting performance in that latest blockbuster movie. And then, one day, the cheering stops. This podcast is all about catching up with these stars of yesterday to find out where they're at now and who they are as people, beyond the stardom. This is a true human interest podcast about the people we loved to root for. And now, your hosts, Joe Mastriona and Joe Boglino.
David Mark's book, Leveling the Playing Field, The Story of the Syracuse 8, Foreword by the late, great Jim Brown. In 1970, I answered the call of a group of young African-American men at Syracuse University and traveled to Syracuse to see if I could be of help in resolving a situation that threatened their future as athletes. I went with the intention of being a conservative, moderating force. My original goal was to help them reconcile with the coach, my old coach, so they could get on with their careers. But these young men showed me they had something more than that in mind. While their courage was obvious, it was their wisdom that impressed me most deeply. They were young men, but they were wise men. They had the foresight and the ability not only to stand up for themselves, but to outline their principles in terms that would live in history and benefit future generations. How bright can young men be? Just have a look at their resumes today, and you will see academic accomplishments and graduate degrees and career achievements that demonstrate that the men who became known as the Syracuse 8 had a far more realistic grasp of who they were and what they were capable of doing than those who ignored, rivaled, or opposed them. I think of the Syracuse 8, and I cannot help but also think of the young men who are now making millions of dollars playing sports and their endless exhibitions of individuality displaying so little sense of being part of any community. The Syracuse Eight took action and risks on behalf of themselves in a way that was designed to benefit others. Did they succeed? Look at the things they were asking for in 1970. An end to race discrimination in assigning players positions. An end to race discrimination in academic support for student athletes. Medical care that prioritized the health of the athletes above patching them up for the next game, and a diverse coaching staff capable of relating to the needs of all the team members. As punishment for demanding conditions that are now taken for granted by student athletes entering any collegiate sports program in the nation, they were denied their careers as athletes. This is what was done to Muhammad Ali when he was stripped of the heavyweight boxing championship for standing up for his right to protest the Vietnam War. This is what was done to Nelson Mandela when he was denied his place among his people and thrown in prison for 27 years. If you have the privilege, as I have had, to talk to the members of the Syracuse Eight, you will hear no sense of bitterness or revenge in their voices as they recount their stories. Instead, you are impressed by a humbleness and a humility that grow out of their appreciation of what they were able to accomplish for others. It is my personal hope that some of those others will read this book, know the names of their benefactors, and be influenced to follow in their footsteps. Jim Brown.
This week's episode, we want to welcome to the Life After Fame Spotlight, Clarence Bucky McGill. Clarence, his profound moment of fame happened in 1970, and much of today's discussion will wrap around his involvement and inclusion and being a part of the Syracuse Eight. We'll highlight his story, his involvement, and the consequences of what occurred during that time. Clarence, thank you so much for joining us today on Life After Fame.
Thank you, Joe. My pleasure, and I feel blessed and honored.
As do we've gotten to get to know you for the last 45 days. I'm not being patronizing here. I'm better for it. Joe's better for it. We've just really enjoyed our conversations. Before we get into the Syracuse Eight story and the story of Syracuse in the late 60s and what you went through there, I think it's probably appropriate to discuss the 60s and the social movements, the civil rights movements that occurred during that time that, in a sense, led to a posture or a position for the action of many athletes, many minority athletes in the 60s. You are a product of the 60s. Clarence, talk to us about the impact of that time and how that kind of fueled the Syracuse Eight into taking the actions that they took in 1970.
Okay, again, thank you both for allowing me to speak. As you mentioned, my name is Clarence Bucky McGill, and I'm originally from upstate New York, Binghamton, New York, which is upstate, a small town. And I went to school, entered Syracuse University at 17 years old in 1967. For those of you that are much younger than I am, you may have not experienced the late 60s in regarding your life. But during that time, our country went through some tumultuous changes in regards to political and civil obedience and disobedience. You may recall in the late 60s, we could talk about the civil rights movement, the civil disobedience movement. We could talk about Kent State University, Woodstock, the Vietnam War, the Martin Luther King's movement, the murder of John Kennedy and the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, Muhammad Ali. We could go on, and I'm missing many, but realizing that all these events happen basically at the same time. I always say it was like a George Floyd exponentially. So also involved were many athletic demonstrations based on race and gender. You can talk about the athletic campus demonstrations, Oregon State, Princeton, University of Texas, University of Washington, Buffalo State, University of Indiana, University of Pittsburgh, of course, University of Wyoming. So there were probably about over 150 demonstrations dealing with athletics that dealt with race and gender. And you can verify that by looking it up. So in regards to all that was happening at Syracuse University, it was just a portion of the times. It was just something that America was experiencing. And unfortunately, or fortunately for me, I was experiencing it directly because of my participation in the Syracuse University football program.
Clarence, can I ask you a question about some of what you just mentioned? It almost seems like the 60s began a time when African-American athletes were taking charge of their lives. You had Cassius Clay protesting the war. He didn't go. He got the consequences of that action was pretty severe. You have Tony Smith and John Carlos in the Olympics that raised their fists in a very famous podium stance. I think that Harry Edwards told many minorities not to participate in the Olympics. So there was a lot of discourse happening, and it wasn't just football. It was almost in every corner of the athletic world in the 60s. What do you think was the catalyst to spark that whole movement? We can talk about Martin Luther King, who was a catalyst in that whole civil rights movement, but was there something else that kind of spurred the African-American athlete to say, okay, we're going to take responsibility for our lives. We're going to take charge of our lives and no longer maybe be a pawn on the chessboard?
Joe realized that it was not just the 60s. It happened at the turn of the century, the 1900s. You talk about Jack Johnson. You talk about Jesse Owens. And then all the athletes that came up to this day. We can talk about Kurt Flood. You can talk about Jackie Robinson. You can talk about Joe Louis. You can talk about Muhammad Ali. But believe me, since the 1900s, and really Jack Johnson to me, there has been a pride that we as African Americans started feeling in concert with our political movements. Realized that all these athletes, especially in the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, they weren't recognized by America until the world recognized them. So America had no intention of recognizing these great athletes until the world, Jesse Owens, till they recognized them. So, we could just.
And by the way, Jesse Owens, what he did in the 1936 Olympics in Munich, you talk about facing and staring down racism under the nose of Adolf Hitler, and yes, he was very successful. You talk about a lightning spark in the 30s. That's certainly true with Jesse Owens.
Yes, and there's just so many others that you can speak of that had a contribution in regards to civil rights and equality. And it started in athletics, but it spilled over into economics, politics, etc. So just for us, I think in the late 60s, there was a fulcrum. There was a point that the whole country was involved. And our movement in Syracuse and others in other parts of the country, it just wasn't only athletics. It had to do with their neighborhoods. It had to do with the community. It had to do with, it spilled over into many different areas that we think we were successful in just making sure that we fought for equality. It's that simple.
I think one thing that's really important here real quick is that you mentioned your childhood and you didn't experience the racism that you were exposed to at Syracuse. In fact, we watched a video of you giving a presentation and you showed an elementary school picture of the class. It was a class picture. And you were funny
you want
because
me to show it to you? I have it back here.
You were the only black student in that class picture. And you said, well, I guess you can't. Can you guess which one I am? So it was quite funny. And yeah, we're showing this on our video right now. And
yeah, just hold it straight up. Yeah, you're good.
Hold it straight.
Clarence. Yeah, straight. Yep. A little bit down.
A little bit back.
Right there. There you go. Yep. There you go.
Yeah.
Yep.
You talk about possibly feeling the pressure of not only just being a minority, but of being exposed to some things. But I think what lends tremendous credibility to what you're about to tell us around the Syracuse 8 has to do with your childhood in your hometown, really with not a lot of African Americans around, but you said that you didn't really experience racism or bigotry within the sports that you played, for the coaches that you played for, and that kind of thing.
Yes. As you mentioned, and as I mentioned, I was in Binghamton, New York. I grew up in that community. I went, of course, to grammar school, junior high school, we used to call it, and high school. I played sports. I was involved in clubs, German club, and I was elected to the student body, student assembly, student council, if you will. And the people in the community were just great people. The friends of mine and their parents, and I stayed over their house, and we got to know each other, very intimately, because they were just good people. And you're right, I didn't experience racism as my wife did, who grew up here in Richmond, Virginia, and dealt with segregation. The experience in my childhood was a little different in terms of the lack of racism that I didn't see. My older brothers say they saw it, but I didn't see it. And most of the people in Binghamton, New York at that time were equal in terms of their economic revenues. Everybody was poor middle class or lower middle class, and that was everybody. Because I grew up next to a Latino family and an Italian family, and we were in the middle. And most of my neighborhood was Italian, so we got along with everybody. And the Italian men, being my mother was a single parent, they protected my mother profusely, and they just satisfied her every need just based on her personality and her work ethic and raising 3 kids.
Imagine that, Clarence, right? People treating people like people.
That's all.
Regardless of your race, regardless of your female or your male or what, just people treating people like people and taking care of one another as a community.
And that's all it was. And so when I entered Syracuse University in 1967, in September, a couple things happened that I wasn't used to. Number one, my defensive end coach told me and another guy, don't go out with white women in terms of socializing. Now, I was thrown off by that because I've never heard anybody comment on somebody's, social behaviors like that so directly. And secondly, my father divorced my mother a long time ago, and he married a white woman, and half of my family was white. So I grew up with white brothers and sisters, and we loved each other as brothers and sisters do to this day.
Yeah.
So that kind of threw me off, along with some other issues, and you're going to speak to those demands because it started to get repetitious. And I said, look, I'm not going for this because I'm not used to this. I never experienced this. So as a team, as a group within the team, we fought back, but we'll discuss that a little further.
So jumping into that, Clarence, let's talk about the 4 demands. And the 4 demands came from, like anything, getting fed up. You guys were fed up with the treatment that you were receiving as African-American players and people. And so the 4 demands, I'll go through them here, and then I'd love for you to, expand on each one. So the Syracuse 8 story really starts with the 4 demands. And the first one was end race discrimination in assigning player positions. The second one was academic support for student athletes. The third one was medical care. And the fourth was diverse coaching staff capable of relating to the needs of all team members. So we'll jump back to 1, which is end race discrimination in assigning player positions. And I think a lot of us understand already what that looks like, right? I can think of one position right away. It's quarterback.
Yeah.
That's one. But there was other ones. Yeah. So I'd love for you to, expand on that.
It was in those days. It was a quarterback. It was the center. What you used to call the offensive lineman plays. So that was it. But let me just drop back regarding Syracuse University and its inception. In 1870, Syracuse University was created to educate Blacks, Native Americans, and women. And that was its charge by the president of the university at that time. Syracuse always had a mission statement, a vision to treat people right and not deal with any racist type of actions in regards to admission to the university. Over the years, that changed, but nevertheless, that's the way they started. In regards to the demands that we made in 1969, 1970, the issue of being assigned or having your athletic assignment, your football assignment. When I say assignment, is who's playing quarterback, who's playing defensive end, who's getting into the starting position, starting rotation. There was a couple scenarios that were always thrown at us, and one was an old trick in sports is that you have 2 or 3 African Americans competing for the left end position. So you put a bunch of people at one position to compete. So you're not going to have a lot of African Americans on the field at the same time. And alluding to African Americans on the field, on the football field, as you may know, in the old days, up north, you can only have 2 African Americans on the field at the same time. They call that twosome.
If and you it was were an unwritten rule, right? But it was a rule that all these coaches followed. That all the only coaches, have 2 on the field at once.
All the coaches were very aware of it. But moreover, if you were a northern city like Syracuse, or northern university, or northern team like Syracuse, and you went down to play Alabama and Georgia during that time, and you allowed a black to score, you're going to have a riot. So most times they wouldn't let any black players score when you went down south to play.
I think there was also other preconditions too, right, Clarence? If you were to come down past the Mason-Dixon line, they may not even be able to bring an African-American on the team with them down there, right?
Right.
Many universities had, University of Buffalo had that problem. They were taking a train, and the university that they were playing refused to play them, and so the whole team didn't play at Buffalo, and so they celebrate that even today.
Yeah. They stood up for it as a team. Yeah, they stood up. They said, "Nope, we're not going to play this game." Then, good for them.
But yes, but most teams and most universities didn't stand up.
That's right,
because that was a sign of the times. And the wild part, and I mentioned this to you, all these old coaches know that, but they won't fess up to it. So it's strange that that's really currently a pet peeve of mine. But secondly, you mentioned academic support. When I was going to school, our academic advisors, my academic advisor was my defensive end coach again, the same person that told me not to go out with white girls.
Right, he was.
He's already giving bad social and life advice, and now he gets to coach you on academics.
And I'm not going to mention his name because he recently died about a year ago. But anyway, so they wanted the athletes, the black athletes particularly, to not matriculate, just take courses to keep you eligible. So they would sign you up with football and baseball and tennis. So those are the courses that they wanted to sign you up. And that what really triggered me, and this was my freshman year, one of us, African Americans, he was the president of the National Honor Society. He was out of Boston, and they wanted him to take those courses. So then that finally struck a nerve in me, and I said, wait a minute, now there's something's up with this. So what I did, I advised everybody to fill their courses out in pencil on the curriculum card that you had to give your academic advisor, but the coach, to him to sign, and then you give it back. So when you filled out in pencil and he signed it, we took it and we erased it and put some applicable courses that would allow us to matriculate in a civil fashion. And so that's how, and I always claim this, I got a couple of our guys PhDs, and one's an attorney. That's all because of me, because they erased their freshman courses.
Smart.
And put the appropriate courses down.
But so let's talk about this real quickly. So for white players, were they subjected to the same comment by the coaching staff to say, hey, take PE or bowling or that kind of thing?
I cannot verify that didn't happen to them. I knew it happened to all of us. So, but I never really got into to verify if that happened to them.
Clarence, what do you think that was? What was the reasoning that you think that they were doing that in terms of here's the courses that you should take and advising you guys that way? What did you guys suspect the reasoning for that?
I really don't know, because particularly myself, they knew I graduated from high school, from a New York school, and New York State required a regents exam for you to matriculate. So you had to pass state exams to be able to move forward and go to the next grade and then eventually graduate. So I never understood why they did that. So it's strange.
Can I just take a stab at it? And again, this is just me guessing at it. But I believe that it has to do with number one, which is assigning player positions. And it's been said, not necessarily maybe in here, but many times, that they didn't believe that the African-American athlete was smart enough to play the quarterback position. Probably the same with the center position, as you mentioned, right? He's the one that's calling the plays, and they're basically, in my opinion, giving you those courses were stating, hey, we want to keep these players eligible. We don't think they're smart enough to take regular courses or even AP tough courses. Let's give them the badminton and the football and baseball and basketball courses.
let me address that. Number one, I'm gonna diffuse some of what you said, because in 1949, Syracuse University had a quarterback named Aveda Stone. And Aveda Stone was a pretty bright guy. And Aveda came out of Washington, D.C. His parents were doctors. But they didn't like Aveda Stone because he always dated white women. And that was a problem to the coaching staff. But Aveda was a 1949 quarterback. Now, that never happened again. I think there was another quarterback. I can't remember his name. He's out of Canada. He left. But anyway, my point is, dealing with the quarterback situation, as it came towards my era in 1967, they promised another quarterback who was a friend that was one of the Syracuse Eights, Dana Harrell, who came out of Indianapolis and had high accolades. And they promised him that he was going to be a quarterback. And he didn't have an opportunity to try out for the position. They put him at quarterback for one play. And then he never saw the quarterback position again. My point to you, Joe, is, Joe M., I never figure out their strategy or behavior towards black quarterbacks, but I do know that those particular positions based on race, that was valid. So I can only tell you that.
Yeah, sure.
And also, but go ahead. I was going to speak on.
The next one, is medical care, and
for
I think
all
this will
athletes,
be,
by the way, medical care.
Excuse me.
For all athletes. It wasn't just for you guys.
Medical care has what is pretty infamously known now. Our particular medical doctor and head of our medical department was a gentleman who was a gynecologist, knew nothing about sports medicine, and was our coach's best friend and golf buddy. So he was heard saying that he hated touching black people. So with this in mind, he did some very evil things. He changed the dosage on one of our players so that he was not allowed to play football because of medical reasons, which was absurd because he changed. He did a lot of evil and just
well, he wasn't qualified. Yeah, he purely was not qualified to be the team doctor. Yeah,
and everybody knows that at Syracuse that played during my time. They know that, but they keep it quiet. And as I mentioned to you the other day, that when we asked some of the white players to, confirm or at least discuss this situation, what if they say they want to keep it, and this is a quote unquote, we want to keep it in the rear view mirror. So they just don't want to discuss it because the facts and the truth will set you free.
Yeah. They'll also keep you accountable, right? And a lot of people don't want to be accountable. Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but I'm always trying to seek the truth through this story, and maybe someday I will. But as you mentioned, or as I'm going to mention, it's in a book. It's the Syracuse 8, Leveling the Playing Field. And much of this information I'm discussing and much more information is in that book. Hopefully people will read it and get an understanding of what was happening during the late 60s and 70s in regards to athletics in colleges. But the third thing I think you talked about, we talked about the assignment of positions. We talked about the academic piece. We talked about the medical piece. And the last piece, our fourth demand, was we wanted a Black coaching person. Syracuse University had never, since 1870, hired anybody Black in the athletic department, no matter what sport it was. So we just wanted the first African-American coach to be part of the Syracuse University team, and it would have been somebody I think we could have related to in regards to any athletic issue that arose. And fortunately, we did get that person. His name was Carmen Jones, but he was really, he wasn't respected as the coach. There was a whole lot of things. They didn't put his name in the program. They just, Ben really felt that he was compelled to take Carmen Jones. He was out of Florida A&M, and Jake Gaither, the famous coach, Florida A&M, recommended him. But at that time, when he came on the team, the Syracuse 8, we already were committed to our civil disobedience, and we wanted everything, all the demands that we just reviewed. Interesting enough, all those demands today are just seem common and are a given, but at that time in the late 60s, they were not.
Yeah, it's a hint of Jim Crow for sure. And so 4 demands were made. In fact, the pursuit, the lobbying for a African-American coach had gone on for some time and went unanswered. The head coach at the time, Ben Schwartzwalder, which we'll talk about in a moment, who almost is the core antagonist of this whole story. And I feel like we'll talk at great length about it. These 4 demands weren't addressed. I think they were dismissed. You guys were seen as probably spoiled, rotten brats, and forget it, beat it. Everything is the way it is. We're going to keep things status quo. In 1970, in the spring of 1970, the 8 of you, in fact, there was 9, I believe, originally, but the 8 of you got together. Talk to us about the day or the night or the moment that it was decided upon banding together and boycotting to at least try to influence or push this agenda forward.
Okay. Realize that during this boycott, there was a New York Human Rights Commission report, and they did an investigation. And then there was also a chancellor's group of people that chancellor put together to review our demands and our allegations, if you will. And that group also finished the report, and both reports confirmed and verified what we were saying. That happened, and nothing was said or done about that. So eventually, Jim Brown, and all this was happening in about a year span. So Jim Brown came to Syracuse University to help us because he also was coached by Ben Schwartzwalder like we were. And Ben stayed, Jim Brown stayed, the late Jim Brown. He stayed for about a week, and we got to know him pretty well, and we talked about all the different situations, and we went out to dinner, and we had a lot of fun just getting to know the great Jim Brown. But the night before he left, Jim said, "Hey, you guys are making a stand here, but your NFL careers are going to be impacted. Your life may be impacted," because we didn't know whether we were going to keep our scholarships or not, and we couldn't afford to stay at Syracuse if we didn't keep our scholarships. So Jim said, "I'm going to leave tomorrow on the plane, but you guys tell me what you want to do tomorrow." And Jim said, "I will back you no matter what the decision that you make as a group. So we cried and laughed and fought that night, all night long. And in the morning, when Jim came over, we said, we can't let this happen to anybody else. So we, as a group, the Syracuse 8, decided to continue the boycott until all our demands were met, or at least looked at. That happened. That's the night that you're referring to. And thank God for Jim Brown. And again, he just passed away 2-3 months ago, I think. And he was very influential, very supportive, very big brother, father-like figure regarding what we were going through, because he knew the coaching staff, he knew the university, and he was just a highly respected athlete and actor and political activist. As I mentioned, we decided to continue the boycott, and it continued in my life for years, because I had nothing to do with Syracuse University once I left. Now, fortunately, the chancellor at that time, Corbally, who eventually they got rid of him because of his stance, because he was a fair man, but Ben Schwartzwalder was like the Nick Saban of today. He had more power than the chancellor of the university, so they eventually ran Corbally out. But the group of folks that Corbally put together to look at our situation, I forgot what they called it. It was a commission or a council, he called it. They made sure that we had the money to continue our education, so our scholarships were not revoked. They wanted to revoke them, but these Corbally and the group of people, they were faculty and students and staff, they voted, I assume, not to allow our scholarships to be revoked, so we all graduated. And that was a fine thing, too. We all graduated with our undergraduate degrees from Syracuse University.
So, Clarence, what did you lose in this process, though? You got the scholarship, but what did you lose? You guys didn't play ever again, right?
No, that was never.
Yeah.
Never played. I let me see. There was a little semi-pro team in my hometown that I practiced with and I messed around with. But in terms of the accolades that I was getting as a junior at Syracuse University, starting at defensive end, and as I mentioned to you yesterday, nowadays, if I was a junior starting at defensive end in the 1970s, I would have been a freshman starting in these days, because back in the 70s, all college and university teams had a freshman team. So they had a freshman program. So everybody in the country had a freshman program, or they called it frosh. So you could not enter college from high school and go directly to play on the varsity team. That was not allowed. You had to play on the freshman team. With my experience of starting at Syracuse University in my era as a junior, I had a pretty good future. Some pro teams were talking to me, and I still had another year, a full year to finish, because I stopped my junior year. So I was looking forward to playing in the NFL. And I thought I had the skills and the size to do it. And most of my coaches that I played with felt I had the skill, the size, and the attitude. You got to be a little mean out there. So they thought I had it. And unfortunately, that was stripped away with the boycott, like Jim Brown said. I have no regrets, because we knew what we were doing. And then later, years later, the chancellor of the university at that time, her name was Nancy Cantor. She, in 2006, Nancy is currently the chancellor at Rutgers University, one of their campuses. But she asked us, all the Syracuse 8, all the people that boycotted, to come back to the university because she wanted to honor us with the Chancellor's Medal of Courage that we earned, I believe, through her eyes and through the university's eyes. She wanted us to come back and accept. The Chancellor's Medal of Courage was also bestowed to our president, Joe Biden. He was a Syracuse law student, I believe, graduate, and he also received. So there's different folks. I think Ozzie and Ruby Davis, the actors, the late actors, they received it. So because she personally called and asked me and asked us to attend and come back, that's what we did. And in 2006, we were honored to receive the Chancellor's Medal of Extraordinary Courage. The university apologized officially for the way we were treated, and it was just a nice experience that some sense of reconciliation was met. But nevertheless, it will never redo or
doesn't give you your career back that was possibly taken away from you.
Yeah.
And even if someone could argue, you never know if you were going to make it pro or not. But I would argue that it wasn't only just that you lost a year of playing for your college. Yeah, that was stripped away from you. And in an act that you guys did, as I see as heroic, because you weren't looking just about yourselves. Because if you were, you would have just said, okay, let's just shut up because I'm going to ruin this, whatever it is, for myself, right? For the future.
Joe, I think that's a very good point, because you guys took a stance, and a lot of the African American athletes were asked to do similar types of things, boycott the Olympics, for example, but many didn't because this was their chance, right? And they didn't want to squander their chance. That day that you guys boycotted ended your football aspirations, and you did it. I'm sorry, it was a pretty selfless act, because by doing that, you ended your football career. There's stories about, I think a couple of you went to the Jets right afterward to get a tryout, but when the head coach found out who was on his field and you were part of the Syracuse 8, he didn't even let you guys participate. So you were blackballed completely by an entire industry.
Okay, let me mention that. This guy named McPherson, Coach McPherson, was the head coach at Syracuse University for a while. Nice guy, beautiful person, Coach McPherson. I was having dinner with him years later, and he mentioned just what you were saying, Joe, that when he was coaching at Denver, he was at Denver when we boycotted the Denver Broncos. And he said that there was no way that we were going to play pro football because the coach, Ben Schwartzwalder, went to every team at that time and told them to leave us alone. And that was the first time that I really got a little depressed, because it was coming from a reputable NFL coach and NCAA coach.
Right.
And he said, hey, there was no way. So I knew that happened, but I've never heard it confirmed by, a reputable source. So.
And let's talk about one other thing about this boycott. Now, we're talking 1970. There's no email, there's no social media. But according to the story, Ben Schwartzwalder crafted a letter, and It was to each one of you. It was to be mailed, and it was giving you a choice. But I believe what the story mentions is none of you received that letter. So you didn't even get questioned or propositioned or an opportunity to make any decision. And
Correct.
There was a deadline on that letter. So none of you got the letter. You couldn't respond in kind. So time came, time went. You guys were all off of the team, except for I think one player accepted or was able to come back on. It was such an underhanded way to deal with the situation. It almost was this crushing sledgehammer, done in a way that, oh, we'll have the letter. We'll show that we sent it. We tried to make an overture to these 8, but none of them responded. None of you guys got the mail.
Yeah, that's very true. And that was uncovered to me during the research on this book I mentioned. Nancy Cantor, who was chancellor again at that time, had David Mark, who was the author of the book, but at that time he worked for the Syracuse University Publishing House. The publishing house is, a pretty big place at Syracuse, and they publish a lot of books all over the world. But she had David take a sabbatical for a couple of years to research the Syracuse 8 boycott and also to write the book. David he's an astounding writer, but he passed away, unfortunately. But on his deathbed, he said, this must be my best work because it's going to be my last work. But eventually David mentioned to me and showed us at a dinner this supposed letter that was, again, supposedly sent to us, sent to our homes. And all of us at the same time said we didn't know anything about this letter because none of us received the letter. You're right in terms of the very low situation, the very low act of saying that this letter was sent. And we had an opportunity when Ben knew, and the athletic office knew, somebody knew that the letter was never sent to us.
Let's talk about Ben Schwartzwalder, also known as Old Ben, 25-year coach at Syracuse. In fact, he's got a fairly impressive win-loss record in his coaching career, 178 wins, 96 losses. And think about the number of running backs that played for Ben in the 50s and the 60s. You've got Jim Brown, Floyd Little, Ernie Davis, Heisman Trophy winner, first African-American Heisman Trophy winner, right? Jim Nance, yes. Larry Zonka. He rode on the coattails of these incredibly talented players. And I believe that the public persona of him versus the one behind the scenes, it's unveiling itself here. He is a future Syracuse Ring of Famer. And when you understand the story and you read Leveling the Playing Field, which is a great book about this, and you understand the mission of Syracuse, let me just bring this up real quick. The university was founded as co-educational, open to men and women, white and black. The conditions of admissions shall be equal to all persons. There shall be no invidious discrimination here against women. Brains and hearts shall have a fair chance. So like you mentioned before, in 1870, this is 5 years after the Civil War, it was established as to be a very open and diverse university. Yet, the fact of the matter is that Ben Schwartzwalder, once you begin to understand the story, was a racist. Now, he was a war hero. He had a very, I guess, the accolades that he got within World War II were tremendous, so he had a tremendous reputation. But here he is as the coach. You're being recruited by these fellow players, Jim Brown and Floyd Little, and I suppose they're saying, listen, this is a very open environment for the African-American athlete. And then you get recruited. You said, yes, but I'm going to go for it because it seems like this is a great environment for me to play. And then you find out something different.
Joe,
He's a different
real quick, Schwartzwalder's reputation was, at the time, was the most successful white coach of African American players ever at that time, right? And so, Clarence, from the outside perspective, right, someone's hearing that. Isn't that progress? Doesn't that count for anything for Schwartzwalder? Inside scenes of that.
Well, let me just back up in terms of that, Joe. That quote you read was from about no insidious discrimination. That was from Reverend Dr. Jesse Peck, who was the first president of the Board of Trustees at Syracuse University. So just let me put that in context. That's the way Syracuse developed in 1870. Now, in regards to Ben, let's realize that Ben, again, as I mentioned, was the Nick Saban of the time. Ben was a D1 national champion at Syracuse University. And he, as you mentioned, he coached the first African-American Heisman Trophy winner, the Elmira Express. And he was out of Elmira, and that was Ernie Davis. With that in mind, along with other Black athletes that were there, that Billy Haskins, who was he was a track man, but he also played football. He out of Binghamton, New York, in 1950. Let me say there was a potpourri of Black athletes that went to Syracuse University. With that impression and with that image, I thought, like most of us, that was a panacea for Black athletes. Mm-hmm. And you were going to get treated with equality. You were going to get treated as a young man, and you were going to get treated in a fair and equitable manner. That's what I thought. And as quiet as it's kept, my freshman year, we were, because we were on the freshman team. Because we all had to play freshman football. We were treated pretty good. I wasn't aware of the type of insidious discrimination as Dr. Peck mentioned until we got down the road a piece to my sophomore and junior years. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. So.
No, it's interesting because I find it, and I'm an outsider, and I find it hypocritical that the university is going to put Ben's name in a ring of fame. They obviously value wins and losses at whatever cost versus the character of a man. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is that how he handled the boycott, how he handled the African-American situation at the time of his coaching is abysmal. Now, maybe he's a product of the times. I hate to say that Jim Crow and racism at that time, maybe people were just a product of their environment. The fact of the matter is we all have brains. We all have to figure that out and recognize this is wrong. He had the opportunity. His exposure to such tremendous talent and people of character should have influenced his evolution as a man. I look at it pretty black and white myself, and I know that is ironic too, but I don't think that they're putting his name up there by not recognizing the character of how he handled really probably one of the biggest moments in his coaching career, 1970 and the Syracuse 8's boycott of his program.
Okay, let's understand that Ben Schwartzwalder was a World War II hero and veteran during World War II. That's number one. Number two, he was a national champion coach. Number three, he's got people like, who was in the backfield with Floyd Little and Larry Zonka? Who do you think was in the backfield with them? Because there was three people in the backfield, the way they had a single wing. You know who was the wingman? Tommy Coughlin. The coach, the ex-coach of the New York Giants, also a Super Bowl winner. Mm-hmm. So you have folks like not only Tommy, but other folks of acclaim that are in Ben's corner. They know that Ben was wrong. You can't help but know Ben was wrong. But Ben used racial slurs freely, and he didn't say the N-word. I didn't hear that. But he said every other racial slur, every other ethnic group, and he was wide open with it. Everybody knows that. Nobody will say it, but everybody that played with him know that. They know that. You couldn't help it, but you can't help not know it. But on the other hand, you have, as I tell you, my generation that support what the Syracuse 8 was about and support what our demands and support what we were trying to do. And then you have the other side. You're going to have the Tommy Coffins. And I'm not calling Tommy Coffin out, but I'm just mentioning that you have a strong support system for Ben Schwartzwalder, regardless of his racist move.
But in the book, in the
go ahead. Look, both I got both.
I know, yeah. Real quick, just I think in the book that something that struck me was a chapter in the book of Leveling the Playing Field that was called Progress and Myths. Progress and myths. And I think what you're saying here is one side believed that when it didn't happen and there was all this progress being made, right? He's the most successful coach in terms of white coach for African-American players. And then the other side is the myths. And the myths are that, yeah, he was throwing around racial slurs all the time. As far as I'm concerned, a coach is not just a coach. They're a teacher. They're a guide to young athletes, male or female, whatever. And he knew what was right and wrong, Clarence, and he didn't stand up for you guys. You had to stand up for yourselves by the boycott, and he was unwilling to jeopardize his reputation in the white community. Let's just say it, in the white community, as well as he didn't want to put his job on the line. You guys were willing to put your jobs on the line for the right thing. And as far as I'm concerned, Schwartzwalder was a coward because he didn't stand behind you guys.
Let me also say this, and I think this is a backdrop that has to be said. Ben Schwartzwalder was a military man too. So I can only imagine going through war, people shooting at you, you shooting at people are dying, their heads getting blown off next to you.
Sure.
And you have to follow orders in order to survive. So I think also Ben looked at us as deserters and he depicted us in that image, coupled with being football boycotters. So I understand what you're saying, but I also see how Ben's belligerence, how Ben's upbringing allowed him to be against our actions. But also what's very inexcusable is that the racist environment that he engrossed himself in and that he accepted. And he was from West Virginia. And I can't comment on his upbringing, but I'm sure it's probably anti-Black down the road in terms of everyday life. And I've told you yesterday that America likes or has a sense of reminding Black folks that they're Black every day. And so that's my little thing, that
Yeah.
You see it everywhere. You see it on television. You see it in your everyday walk in life, that they want to remind you, hey, you're Black. So with that in mind, I think Ben was a product of the times.
Yeah.
Now, these times are a little different, I would like to hope. That ring of fame in the dome is going to be interesting because a few months ago, the university gave us a mural in the dome that is supposed to stand forever, recognizing what the Syracuse Eight's action. So you have a mural in the dome that deals with what we're talking about now, and I guess you're going to have Ben's name in the Ring of Fame. And so the struggle still, my point is the struggle continues.
Yeah.
It does. And I don't know, you have to ask yourself about progress. You also understand the position that he craftfully played. This was a powder keg moment. And it's a forgotten story. It's not a story I knew until about 60 days ago. And I think it's almost, in a sense, it's almost a Rosa Parks moment. The fact of the matter is the way that he played it, he took this unbiased position in the middle. There wasn't the white team, the white players of the team didn't come to your defense. In fact, they resented you guys for asking for all this special stuff. And he didn't tell them no. He just said, the white players on my team aren't in agreement. And so I feel like he tried to play the middle so that he could protect his reputation. And that's why I continue to I personally have major issues with honoring this guy in any way. Yes, he won 178 games, but the fact of the matter is that it's people that are important, not wins and losses. And believe me, I'm a massive sports fan. And when my team loses, I am down for a week. But when you get down to it, life is about people and love. And this guy had a chance to rise to the occasion and really make an unbelievable impact. Can you imagine if he would have supported you guys? Oh my God. That could have transformed the NCAA and football in its existence at the time, but he didn't. He maintained the status quo, which was racism, Jim Crow, and he threw his white player under the bus too. I feel like he did that too. He didn't support them. He said, they're in a disagreement with this protest and I have to support them.
And when you say they were in disagreement, this was documented and verified. They signed a letter. 68 players signed a letter saying basically they didn't want to play with us, play football with us. And I still have trouble with that because I'm trying to contact all those 68 players to ask them a question, but I'm having a hard time. Has in the link that I gave you, Joe Ehrman, who was the captain of our team and played for the Baltimore Colts for about 15 years, he has reconciled with us, and he is very gregarious in regards to telling the story of Ben Schwartzwalder and the white players. So you get some insight when Joe speaks about it. But nevertheless, I am in agreement with you in terms of putting his name in the Ring of Honor, but I don't think they're going to not do it. It's going to happen in September during the Army game. So I think they wanted a military backdrop to
I think something should be done, but that's me. I also know that anytime you guys had success, African-American athletes had success, were allowed to play. There's a story where I believe that he had to play 3 African-American running backs at one time because of injury or something. And you guys won. They were having a bad season. You won. And I'm butchering this, and maybe you can add more to it, but he tells the player that, remember, don't get too on your high horse. It's a short walk.
Let me give it to you give you this right. We were playing in Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin. I think they were 8th in the country. We were 9th. They were 8th. And it was an important game. you're right. Some kind of way, once we got out there, all three of the blacks that were running backs were playing. So you had a fullback, a tailback, and a wingback, and Greg Allen was the wingback. Al Newton at that time, his name now is Alif Muhammad, was the fullback, and John Godbolt, my roommate, was the tailback. We won, and we were so happy with the African Americans on the sideline. Look at this. This has never happened. And we crushed them. We beat them 43-0 or 40 something, and 43-6. And everybody had a decent game. So I was really elated. I said, these guys, and has the author of the book that we're talking about, he researched the stats during that game and said this was the highest offensive production ever. So we're walking off the field in Madison, and I'm walking with my roommate, John Godbolt, and Ben Schwartzwalder mentions to John while we're walking off, he said, don't get too happy. It's a short walk from the parlor to the outhouse, quote unquote. So John's whole demeanor went down. He started, it just, and believe me, that's another story, mental health, because John's mental health was impacted by these repetitious statements over 2 or 3 years. But that's a whole nother story. So I'm thinking on the way back, the plane ride back, we having fun. We won the game, and now we're going to be up in the AP polls and all that, Associated Press polls. So we get back, and Monday, we go back to practice, and no, it was Tuesday, because Monday you look at film, and you do a little bit of practice, but Tuesday you go out and set the bar for the next game. And the John Godbolt went back to third string, and the other player went back a little bit to second string. So that was and from a football perspective or from an athletic perspective, that says a lot. You don't need to have anybody verbalize that. That image told it all. And it was just that was the nature of our environment. And that's what we had to experience. And that's why we boycotted.
So talk to us about Jim Brown and his involvement with your career at Syracuse and then afterwards. And this is the late Jim Brown that just passed away a couple months ago.
Jim, as I mentioned, came to Syracuse to help us. It was shortly after he decided not to go back to Al Davis, Oakland Raiders owner, and realized Al Davis went to Syracuse University, for those who don't know, and played football at Syracuse University. But Jim Brown came to Syracuse. I picked him up in my little raggedy car at the airport, and I took him back in my little raggedy car. But as I mentioned, we spent a few days with Jim, and we got to know him. And we got to know him Jim Brown, he liked to play basketball, race you on the 40-yard dash, and did something else. And I noticed that he tried to do that later on television with Franco Harris, the same three things that he would hustle people to do. And so what he would do, he'd play you one-on-one, and he took $75 from me. And I said, you're going to take $75 from a little poor college student? And he had it in his hand. He turned his back and walked away with my money.
He still
took it. He still took it. He's playing for keeps.
I loved it. I remember that image. I said, he took my money. And he said, you're on my list, because I got people on my list I beat. And he said, Bill Russell's one, and he was naming some people. He said, he's on the list. And Jim Brown could play a little bit. He had a little funny shot. But Jim, when he was playing in college, Jim was the number one scorer. But he got confronted with some racial problems that is pretty well known, so he stopped playing basketball. But in regards to Jim's personality, he was very easy to talk to, and he was really, like I say, older brother. You could really bounce things off of him, and he would give you the type of response and the type of answers that you would need that made sense. And he was very committed and loyal to any movement that he involved himself in. And he said he was going to help us through this. He said, I'm going back to Los Angeles. And Dick Cavett, who was the Jay Leno of the talk shows at that time, TV talk shows, he said, I'm going to talk to Dick Cavett and I'm going to get on his talk show, a late night talk show, and talk about the Syracuse movement here. And he did that. So Jim was just a very upright person in regards to dealing with political and social issues. So
he certainly was.
We loved him for that.
Yeah. I feel like he was a big part of that whole, especially the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yes.
He carried a torch for civil rights and
yes, he did
that for his entire career. So, Clarence,
but realize, Jim, let me just say this. Jim Brown never had a football scholarship, ladies and gentlemen. Right. They would not give Jim Brown. Jim Brown was a great athlete, and he was a great student. But Syracuse University didn't like Jim Brown. But the lacrosse coach loved Jim Brown. Simmons, Roy Simmons. And he's a famous coach. And I think his sons have been coaching lacrosse now. Roy Simmons gave him a scholarship. Ben wasn't going to give him a scholarship.
I was going to say, him and Ben were like this all the time, butting heads, right? But he had to deal with it.
The reason Jim Brown played a lot of football, there were 3 people hurt in front of Jim Brown. And they had to play Jim Brown in one game. And once they played him, they couldn't keep him off the field.
They couldn't keep him off.
It was undeniable. Yeah. It was the eye test, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolute tremendous 21st century athlete.
Yeah. Yes, he was.
Yeah. Clarence, you graduate.
Yes.
Somehow the tremors of this whole affair begin to fade, allow you to focus on your studies. You and the other 7 of the Syracuse 8 can no longer play football. I think you all focus on your degrees. I think you all got your degrees.
Yeah,
what was life?
In advanced degrees.
Advanced degrees, right.
I have a master's degree. We have an attorney. We have a PhD. We have, most of us got advanced degrees, and just decided, hey, it's time for education because this athletic thing not going to work. So,
when you graduated from Syracuse, was the first time that you came back in 2006 when you were given the Chancellor's Medal?
Yes, that was when I left Syracuse.
30 plus years.
Yes, sir. I said I will not return to this place because it was too demoralizing in terms of what I wanted to do with my life. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, you never know. I have no regrets because you never know what would have happened if I would have went on to play professional football. Because I know I would have went on to play professional football. But again, the way we were taught to tackle with our heads up and our necks locked, the style was to go with your head first and then wrap your arms around the person. So you never know. I could have really received a lot of head trauma or a severe head trauma. Excuse me. I'm talking now. See, I might have head trauma now. But anyway, excuse me. But you notice a lot of ex-football players from my era, and they're seriously injured and dementia and all types of head trauma related diseases. and it's really sad. So maybe it was a blessing, and I think it was a blessing. God had a game plan for me, and I'm happy to be married, have kids, have grandkids, and be a part of the Richmond community, trying to change the Richmond community.
I think that is the gift, Clarence. I think that's part of the gift, right? Sometimes we can't see it when we're in it, but I think you've got great perspective here. Hey, the Mike Websters of the world, tragic. The Junior Seau's, tragic. And we could just keep going on and on. And we never know what could have, should have, would have happened. But I think it is a really good insight on your part to see the positive that came out of something that was really negative. And it just goes to your character and who you are, and also being part of that Syracuse 8 and standing up for what was right, not only for yourselves. And I just want to reemphasize this to our audience. You stood up not just for yourselves, you stood up for other African American players, for future generations. And in my opinion, you guys are a huge reason why things have changed and have progressed. It's still not perfect. It's still not even close to perfect or any of that. I'm not even insinuating that, but I am saying that you guys are a huge factor in these changes that have been made, the awareness to the general public. Myself, I didn't know, like Joe said, about the Syracuse 8 until 60 days ago. I knew the story of Ben Schwartzwalder with Ernie Davis, because they had made a movie about it, and
Dennis Quaid was
Dennis Quaid.
That's right.
And I love Dennis Quaid. I wonder if Dennis Quaid even really realizes the character that he was playing. I don't know. That's all.
We had some people, as I understand, that consulted with them. I didn't during that movie. You also talk about head trauma, and I could have avoided the severe head trauma like some of the people you mentioned, Junior Seau. But also, Joe, remember, I could have been a multimillionaire.
I know. I wonder. Totally, Clarence. Yes, you could. Yeah, multimillionaire, and
but in money.
I wonder though, if we all could go back and we talk to some of those players with that severe head trauma and the injuries, and say, hey, if you could do it all over again, knowing what you know now, would you not? You just forego the money and the fame,
that's right,
and keep your brain. And a lot of those guys, the average age of death for NFL players is in their 60s, as opposed to regular humans. We're in our 80s and things like that. And so, yeah, I know it's a trade-off either way, but I think that it sounds like you've done great for yourself. We got to meet your wife briefly yesterday, a lovely wife and a family, and we're thrilled to have had you on, Clarence. This has been, I don't mean to overemphasize this, but it really has been life-changing for Joe and I, because we've gotten very well educated with your story, the Syracuse 8. It's made us better human beings, and we want to thank you here at Life After Fame for giving us that gift.
Thank you. And let me also say that the remaining members of the Syracuse 8, 3 of them have passed. We bleed orange. We are very committed to Syracuse University. We love Syracuse University. And look, Syracuse University may be the only Division I team that has 3 major coaches that are African American: the football coach, the basketball coach, and the women's basketball coach. we are proud that this has been done, and we'd like to think that we influenced that.
Agreed.
But I also want to thank you too for allowing me to share the story. You're right. The story is under the shadow at times, and Syracuse University sometimes I feel encourages that, because, as we just mentioned, it's a two-edged sword that they think they have to navigate. So, hey, we'll see how successful they are in the navigation over time. I think that truth will prevail eventually, and things will be set straight. When that will happen, maybe not in my lifetime, but with shows like you and with individuals that, like yourself, that just want to expose the truth, that's so positive, and that's so necessary, particularly in today's times when a lot of news and a lot of facts are being just misused and just incorrect. So I really thank both of you for your work as journalists, as just honest people to try to give your public and your listening audience the truth.
Happy to be in service to you,
Our
Clarence.
pleasure and our honor.
Yes.
Thanks again, Clarence.
Yes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this captivating journey through history and sport as we delved into the remarkable story of Clarence Bucky McGill and the Syracuse 8. It has been an honor to have Mr. McGill share his experiences, insights, and the pivotal moments that shaped their lives and the landscape of college athletics. In this episode, we uncovered tales of courage, resilience, and determination that have the power to inspire us all. The unwavering commitment of these individuals to stand up against injustice, to challenge systemic biases, and to forge a path for future generations is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. As we wrap up this enlightening conversation, let us remember the invaluable lessons we've learned today. The Syracuse 8's legacy serves as a reminder that the pursuit of equality and fairness is an ongoing journey, one that requires unity, dialogue, and a willingness to confront adversity head-on. Their story is a reminder that progress is possible when individuals dare to speak out and take a stand. We hope that you, our cherished Life After Fame listeners, have been as moved and inspired as we have by the accounts shared here. Take these stories to heart. Let them serve as a beacon of hope in your own endeavors. And remember that change starts with a single voice, a single action, and a collective determination to make the world a better place. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button to stay updated and gain access to previous episodes and exciting new content. You can find us on our website at lifeafterfamenow.com or by subscribing to our YouTube channel at Life After Fame Now Podcast or any other platform where podcasts are available. Join us again for more enlightening conversations and stories that shape our world. Until then, remember to be kind, stay curious, and continue seeking out the untold stories that shape our shared history. On behalf of our guest, Clarence Bucky McGill, and the story of the Syracuse 8, I'm Joe Mastriona with my co-host, Joe Boglino. Thank you for being a part of our podcast community.